languages. Pursuant to Standing Order 1083F and the Order of Reference of Tuesday, December 9th, 2025, we're resuming consideration of the official languages regulations. I'd now like to welcome our special guests. From Talking, Advocating, Living in Quebec, we have Sylvia Martin-Laforge, who's the Director General, and we have Marion Sandilands, who's a lawyer. Am I pronouncing your name correctly? Your name's correctly, yes? Okay, good. You'll have 5 minutes between you for your opening statement, and then we'll proceed to a period of questions with the members of Parliament. So, Ms. Martin-Laforge, over to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair and members of the committee, for the opportunity to appear before you today as part of your review and of the proposed regulations related to Part 7 of the Official Languages Act. So you've introduced me, Sylvia Martin-Laforge, as the Director of TALK, and it's an organization representing English-speaking community in matters of public policy and governance. Our focus on legislation, federal funding frameworks, and intergovernmental agreements that shape the vitality and sustainability of our community. And joining me today is our counsel, Marion Sandilands. Before turning to the substance of our remarks, I would like to acknowledge the extensive and good faith efforts undertaken by Treasury Board Secretariat to consult TALK and other stakeholders from English-speaking community during the drafting of these regulations. The engagement has been meaningful, and we recognize the effort. TALK welcomes the draft regulations. We didn't welcome the Act, but we're here to say that we welcome these draft regulations. They introduce long-needed structure and procedural discipline to Part 7, making it more difficult for federal institutions to overlook their obligations. By requiring Part 7 analysis at key decision points, when programs are created, renewed, modified, ended, or transferred, the regulations improve visibility and accountability for Parliament and for the Commissioner of Official Languages. However, our core message today is this. The regulations operationalize process, not outcomes. In doing so, they expose structural gaps within Part 7 of the Act, gaps that Parliament should address during the statutory review. The regulations require institutions to analyze impacts, identify affected communities, consult stakeholders, and document their reasoning. What they do not require is demonstrable result. A department may fully comply with every procedural requirement and yet leaves conditions on the ground unchanged. That is not a flaw in the regulations. It reflects a structural limitation of the Act. The regulations can discipline decision-making, but they cannot compel measurable improvements in community vitality. This issue is particularly significant in Quebec because Quebec is unique under Part 7. It is the only province where the federal government must simultaneously protect and promote French as a minority language in Canada while enhancing the vitality of the English-speaking community of Quebec. These obligations coexist, but they do not always align seamlessly. The Modernized Act also adds Quebec's Charter of the French language into federal statutes, despite concerns raised by the English-speaking Quebecer stakeholders. The draft regulations provide no guidance on how institutions should navigate the resulting tensions. There is no framework for balancing competing obligations, no requirement to explain trade-offs, and no obligation to demonstrate that the interests of English-speaking Quebecers were assessed independently rather than absorbed in broader policy objectives. When guidance is absent, decisions reflect decisions default to discretion. In Quebec, that discretion often favors preserving federal-provincial relations over advancing minority vitality. Without clearer statutory direction, there is a risk that Part 7 becomes procedurally satisfied, but substantively diluted. This concern is not theoretical. TALK recently filed a complaint with the Commissioner of Official Languages regarding the Canada-Quebec Agreement, implementing the Action Plan for Official Languages. The complaint highlights shortcomings in the application of Part 7.
Ms. Martin-Laforge, I'm sorry to interrupt you. The time is up, so could I ask you to wrap up soon, and then we can go to the questions from members.
Of course, I thought Maitre Sandilands will not be speaking.
It's 5 minutes between
us.
Between
Okay.
you. But there'll be lots of opportunity for discussion, so to cover the content that you need to cover.
Let me go to the closing then.
Thank you.
In closing, TALK supports these regulations as an important step forward. They enhance structure and accountability within the limits of the existing statute, but we must remain clear-eyed about their limits. Process alone will not deliver minority vitality. Achieving real outcomes requires statutory clarity, enforceable obligations, and meaningful accountability, issues Parliament must address in the review of the Act. Thank you, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. We'll now move to the period of question and answer period with members, and I'll begin with Monsieur Joël Gaudin. La parole est à vous pour 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Madam, for being here with us today. What you just said worries me because you mentioned that you favor the regulations. You are in support of the regulations, but you find that the Act is not satisfactory. So I'm trying to understand why it's favorable, those regulations that are responding to the Act, which, in your opinion, are not effective. So could you please elaborate, because it's not clear. This worries me, being favorable, but you are not in favor of the main subject. What do you think about that?
For both official language minorities for years. For 20 years, maybe more, we've been worried about Part 7 in the Act. Alors, on est inquiet du règlement.
So we are concerned with Part 7 of the regulations, however. And we do see progress in the work and in the documentation.
Everyone. So there are procedural parts of Part 7 that are very good. But we still are concerned because of the alignment with the Charter of French Language in the Act. So we were against the modernization of the Act, let's be clear, mostly because it included the Charter of French Language in the Act. And so we're the only jurisdiction that has that construct of having provincial and federal within the Act. And so it shows in Part 7 regulations, and there's no way to, il n'y a pas de façon de décortiquer.
It's difficult to tell how Part 7 will help us as an English-speaking community, or how amongst the Francophones who are the majority in Quebec and Francophones who are minority in the rest of Canada. I think we need to understand that the specificity of Quebec is that it's the only province with the common language of French. And let's not forget New Brunswick, which is the only bilingual province in Canada. That's the reality. Now, beyond all that, I am comfortable with the idea that the Charter of the French language is included in the Act to protect the Goloa village that has been invaded by a sea of Anglophones in North America. I must say that I have nothing against Anglophones. It's a wealth we have in Canada, 2 official languages. Bilingualism is a strength. Unfortunately, it's poorly exploited. Now,
Agree with you. What we're saying is that Part 7, the regulations, do not express that complexity adequately. That's all.
Mais OK, Madame Martin Laforge.
Ms. Martin Laforge, you are saying that you support those regulations, but in your introductory remarks, you stated that it was great. I know that I'm exaggerating. What I'm trying to say is that you said that it was good at the level of procedure. I agree with you. There will be no result or outcome. So you are in favor of the regulations. You were not in favor of C13. You support the regulations in Part 7. The proposed regulations in Part 7, but we are trying to obtain results. And just like me, you know there's going to be no results. So are you in support because there's going to be no obstacles for Anglophones in Quebec? The objective is not to provide any barriers for Anglophones in Quebec.
There is an improvement. There is an improvement.
Qu'est-ce qu'on devrait mettre dans le règlement pour...
What should be included in the regulations to improve the situation?
Qu'est-ce qu'on devrait mettre dans le règlement?
What should be included in the regulations? It's your opportunity here.
There's 1 minute remaining.
I'm not sure that we can put everything in the regulation because the Act does not allow for much flexibility in the regulation. Better consultation, more results, performance indicators, and certainly what I said earlier, a better understanding of how in Quebec there will be an alignment between our jurisdictional issues between the federal and the prov. Nobody talks about that much. We haven't heard anybody talk about this. In fact, I'm being interviewed by l'Office québécois de langue française in a few weeks. How are they going to come up with a solution as well? I have no idea.
Je m'excuse, le temps est terminé.
I'm sorry, your time is up.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
The floor to Madame Chenette. Minute.
Madame Jeanette, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair.
This is Martin Laforge and Mrs. Sandilands to be here with us today. Clearly, I want to emphasize what you just said as the importance of being fair and respectful of all the minorities in this country. And at the same time, we are in a world where Canada needs to leverage the 2 official languages and the importance of the bilingualism, just as my colleague was mentioning, which is very, very important. So when I'm listening to you that it is hard to measure the outcomes, and we would agree with that, knowing that the government is so diversified that it is very hard to put real outcomes for all to start, I'd like to hear you about if we have the proper data to start with, because in order to set outcomes, we need to have data on our minorities on so many topics. And at the same time, for the data, identify the gap, set objectives, put the action plan, and then bring the indicators. So when you're saying we want to have indicators, do you think that we have sufficient data and that is not what we need to emphasize to get the data of all the minorities in our country? Because a trade-off that you want to emphasize here is it is the data that will allow us where are the gaps that we need and where do we need to make the proper action.
Thank you for that question. The framework that Canadian Heritage has had for years, the Vitality Framework, gives us elements where we can check marks where we can look at the vitality of, and institutions can look at vitality. For example, cultural, economic, representation in the province. That vitality framework is the basis for what we are working on in Quebec. And so from that vitality framework, measures are already there, like the number of this, the number of that, the importance of this, the importance of that. How many schools, how many museums, how many, and not only numeric indicators, but you have to look at the outcomes as well. So teasing out from that framework, both for the francophones hors Quebec. Now, I'm not sure that this and for the English-speaking community in Quebec, not sure that framework will work in Quebec for the majority francophones in Quebec. I don't know how that's going to work. But if both minority communities are working from a framework and institutions are looking at that framework, they will be able to tease out mechanisms and measures, rather, to see if it's working. And they will consult, and we will base ourselves on that framework. So that's where, what we've been doing for years has got to change, certainly in Quebec, because the landscape has changed. And how will the federal government and institutions work that into how they treat the English-speaking community in Quebec?
So, since you were about to kind of share a complaint and an example for us to understand, I'd like to hear what you had to say about that.
Would you like to answer that question?
Are you referring to the complaint?
Like you were about to explain a complaint, so and then we paused, so I wanted to hear the story.
Sure, I can read you the script we were going to read. The complaint that was filed by TALK to the Commissioner of Official Languages, it highlights the shortcomings of the application of Part 7. In particular, and this is as crystallized in the Canada-Quebec Agreement on the implementation of the Action Plan for Official Languages. The problems with that agreement that TALK was complaining about to the commissioner are the absence of a documented impact analysis specific to English-speaking Quebecers in that agreement, the limited consultation with the English-speaking community of Quebec in the creation of that agreement, and a lack of binding safeguards in that agreement to ensure, again, benefits to the English-speaking community of Quebec. Similarly, insufficient transparency in the design of the agreement. If you look at the agreement, it's a transfer of federal money from Canada to Quebec under the rubric of the Action Plan for Official Languages, but it does not contain, in TALK's view, any of the requirements under Part 7 of the Official Language Act in terms of transparency and accountability for that money.
Il reste 50 secondes.
50 seconds.
When you said documented impact was missing, and when I'm saying we need data, and you said, well, we have the framework, so where is the link here?
There is no link. So the agreement doesn't mention anything about measuring the impacts of that federal money on the vitality of the English-speaking community, and that's one of the key pieces of the complaint that was made to the Commissioner of Official Languages.
Thank you.
Terminé. Merci. Merci, Madame Chenette.
Thank you, Ms. Chanette. Mr. Beaulieu, you have 6 minutes. Thank you. Welcome to our guest. I kind of agree with your brief. The concepts are not defined. You have, however, considered the fact that Quebec is the only province with 2 minority language communities in Canada. We have francophones in Quebec are part of the linguistic minority in Canada, and on the other hand, the protection of Anglophone Quebecois is required. And this asymmetry could lead to a decline in the vitality of the Anglophone community, and this may impact the institutional vitality of Anglophone Quebecers. So what will be the outcome then? We don't want to compete. We don't want minorities competing. In Quebec, we do recognize that there's a Francophone majority. Outside Quebec, there's a Francophone minority. Outside this dynamic, the Anglophone community must find its place. It's not easy to find one's place when you have a government in Quebec which does not recognize us as being a Canadian language minority, at least for the time being. That's your position. Very quickly, let's get to the heart of the matter. Essentially, do you think that the Francophones in Quebec are part of the Canadian language minority? Of course, yes. Should the Francophones in Quebec be consulted as well? We will see. We do not know why there's no implementation, recognized implementation within the regulations. How will that be done? If we are concerned, it's because there's no clarity. We do not see how that will be done within the regulations in Part 7. But would you agree that positive measures be taken for French in Quebec? There are already positive measures for French in Quebec, but they are very minimal. There's the teaching of French. Well, I don't know what they are, but I do know that in Quebec, the government of Quebec has instituted those measures for the vitality of French in Quebec. What about the federal government? Well, the federal government, looking at the vitality framework, before 2023, when it was included in the Act, that was never an issue.
Wondering what this looks like still. Alors, il devrait y avoir.
So there should be less ambiguity. It should be clearly stated. We don't want to compete. Let me repeat that. We agree that it's not clear. Right now, I think there is some injustice. As you said, during consultations, it takes resources to participate in consultations. It takes resources. But the federal government provides resources only to Anglophone pressure groups. Nothing goes to advocacy groups defending French in Quebec. Do you agree with that?
We're not talking about, that's outside our remit today.
C'est un peu dans le sujet parce que vous dites c'est ambigu, il faut bien définir les concepts.
It's in scope because you are talking about defining concepts. We need to define concepts. So how should those concepts be defined? The Act gives you the possibility of doing it or doesn't. So refer to the Act on modernization. Look at the content of the Act to find out what you could do within the regulations.
Est-ce que les règlements?
And then you'll see how the regulations will be translated in the law. Mr. Beaulieu, you have 50 seconds. Well, I can read out all of the parts in the law related to Quebec in Part 7, or rather related to French in Part 7. When you say it's ambiguous, ministers have responded, we defend French in Quebec. Well, that's new, but because before they always said we defend English in French and we defend French outside of Quebec. Since 2020, they say they defend French in Quebec, but no concrete action has been taken.
Section 41(1)(a) of the
Number was inaudible.
To protect and promote the vitality of the English-speaking community of Quebec, and that is the basis for our presence here today, and that is the basis of the submissions that TALK is making today.
Monsieur Beaulieu. Merci. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. Second round.
Questions. This will be a last round. Et comme je vous ai dit, je vais être très strict avec le temps pour.
As I said earlier, I will be very strict with time.
I may cut you off, and I apologize in advance. Okay, so je passe la parole maintenant à Monsieur Dalton. Monsieur Dalton, you.
Mr. Dalton.
Testimony and what you're bringing here, and I guess I was a little concerned. Okay, not by your presentation, but more some of the things you're saying in that in one hand you like what, as far as the objectives, the goals, but the standards, the objective goals and standards is really, with the regulations and the way of measuring is really lacking. So it seems to be kind of a bit in flux. And I guess the concern is just this, that it really resonates with me, with some of the things you're saying, with the government, Liberal government in general, in the sense that they have. This is a bit of an aside right here, but they talk about housing and the big bureaucracies, but the actual results are not there. Things are get worse, or they talk about major projects, and it's like nice announcements, but the substance is missing. And so that really concerns me when I'm hearing from you that you kind of like the fluff, what you're seeing. And now, but there's no real teeth, there's no real movement. And so I wonder if you can just elaborate a little bit more on that.
Implementation is always difficult. The law, as we see it, is not necessarily giving you a lot of scope for this implementation. You can just go so far. It's not sufficient to discharge Canada's responsibility on Part 7. We agree with that. So by their very nature, and apparently some degree of choice, they're limited in scope, the Part 7 regulations. The architecture emphasizes procedural compliance, analysis, consultation, documentation, and operational process, not outcomes. And that's the concern. There is some improvement over, I've been in official languages for a long time. So I have seen Part 7, they've tried it before. This is not the first time. And so that's what we're telling folks, you've come some way, but you've not come all the way. And so we applaud the progress, but I'm not sure that we will get to the real meat and outcome with the process that you've got.
Thank you. So TALK has asserted that the Government of Canada must both protect and promote the French language in Canada, including in Quebec, and enhance the vitality of the English-speaking minority community. To what extent do these objectives conflict with each other? And is it possible to create programs that can achieve both objectives? You have any examples?
I'm not sure how that's going to happen, but let me give you an example of like when funding happens, right? When money is transferred from the feds to the province, the hope at the provincial government is that there will be global transfers. Okay, so global, that's the hope for the provincial government. So when they get a global transfer, how are they going to apportion to the Francophones and to the Anglophones? How will that happen? We've seen money being transferred into Quebec. We've seen programs transferred to Quebec that have not been able to be used by the English-speaking community. There's a youth employment strategy program a few years ago that was transferred. For 5 years, it was renewed a couple of years ago, a year or so ago. The money came in, our groups didn't have access. Not only that, the $30 million that came in, I'm told, 19 million of it went to the consolidated fund.
I'm going to interrupt.
30
It's only 30 seconds. Okay. So if we had a genie here and had a wand and could give you one wish, one specific, what would it be? Be as concrete as possible with that one wish.
20 seconds.
Review the act. We've said in our recommendations, almost the 5 recommendations, 4 of them say review the act.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Dalton. I now give the floor to Madame Mingarelli for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today, Ms. Martin-Laforge and Ms. Sandilands. So, to start, do you believe the regulation adequately reflects the realities and demographic trends of English-speaking communities in Quebec?
Could you ask that question again, sorry?
Yes. Do you believe the regulation adequately reflects the realities and demographic trends of English-speaking communities in Quebec?
I think that's hard to tell because the act, what we've seen talks about consultation. We believe that English-speaking community is a very unique community. And so we would have to see how this uniqueness is translated by the institutions in serving the needs of the English-speaking community. So that's a question. It's a good question for when we review the act. We will be able to tell if, in fact, the regulations have achieved that goal in your question.
Great, thank you. How can the regulation better ensure that federal institutions take proactive rather than reactive measures to support English-speaking communities in Quebec?
Well, I think that consultation, but consultation in, not just checking a box. Consultation that is attuned to the priorities of the English-speaking community. We are a community without adequate capacity. We do not have federally funded organizations like rest of Canada organizations, and that's not a criticism of the FCFA and their organization. Until relatively recently, in the last 20, 30 years, the English-speaking community was never really seen as a minority community. It's relatively recent history that we have seen ourselves as a minority community, and certainly in the last 7 or 8 years do we feel that we have to say, wait a minute, we're a minority community. How will you be treating us by the government of the province and by the feds as well? We've woken up to the fact that we are a unique community in a majority Quebec situation, and that's a difficult place to be sometimes.
This leads perfectly into my next question, which is, in situations where federal measures to support English-speaking Quebecers may intersect with provincial measures aimed at protecting French, how should federal institutions determine the appropriate balance?
Again, I'm going to have to say consultation. Consultation, consultation, consultation. And I think that really understanding how Bill 1, the Constitution of Quebec, might affect us. I find it a little alarming that many federal individuals have not read Bill 1, have not seen how it could change our situation in Quebec. They talk about federal funding. We won't be able, not just we, any organization in Quebec will not be able to challenge any law. I mean, it's amazing how, without knowledge of provincial legislation going on right now, that there's no understanding how the feds can function in this new environment in Quebec?
35 seconds.
Okay, so in practice, have you observed instances where federal institutions hesitated to take positive measures due to uncertainty about Quebec legislation?
I'm not sure about uncertainty, but many federal institutions don't quite know how to work in Quebec. There's a M30, the M30 law, whereby organizations have to have permission to receive federal money if they have a threshold of funding from the province, and that stops it right then, right there.
I have to cut you off there. I'm sorry, the time is up. Thank you very much. Je passe la parole maintenant à M. Beaulieu.
Mr. Beaulieu, 2.5 minutes. Thank you. I'll try and simplify my question. In essence, official language programs in the budget, they have a budget X for Quebec. You're afraid that because it's not well defined, that'll hurt the Anglophone community. Do you think that in this budget, all the money ought to go to the Anglophone community? Or do you think it would be acceptable for part of it to go to promote French? Mr. Beaulieu, we have to make the pie bigger. You can't work with the pie as is.
Money, because I don't think anybody should be penalized for having conflict or competition. Let's call it competition, not even conflict. Competition in Quebec for money should not be on the backs of a minority or a majority community.
Donc, ce que vous proposeriez, c'est d'augmenter.
So your proposition is to increase the budget overall so that there could be measures.
Probably, but we're not sure what. The federal government in their regulation has to figure out what it is. I don't think it's a community that say, no, don't give money don't give money to the francophones in Quebec.
Là, excusez, parce que ce que
What scares you is that there's less money for the Anglophone community.
là, pourquoi il y aurait une
Well, then why would there be an erosion of...
The division. We have to work together for the vitality of the English-speaking community and for the promotion of French in Quebec. How about if we try and work together and not say there's too much there or there's not enough there? Together. We are in Quebec. We're 1.3 million French first official language spoken. We live in Quebec. We want to stay in Quebec. Let's work together and figure it out.
20 secondes.
20 seconds. But we're really talking about diametrically opposed points of view. You're including English-speaking immigrants in your numbers. But if Quebec wants to protect French, they have to integrate them into the French-speaking society. And we can keep discussing, but we certainly have to keep working together. Time is up. Thank you. Mr. Gaudin, 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I have a question for you. Were you consulted? Were you consulted by the TBS for the draft regulations? Yes. Are there elements that you suggested that are in the draft regulations? As I said in the beginning, we were consulted. We made our suggestions. The TBS knows our position. Everything comes from the Act. Yes, they consulted us. They heard us up to a certain point, but there's a limit. There's a limit for you as well. A limit of what you can put from the legislation into the regulation. And they're only going to review it every 10 years, not every 5 years, says Mr. Gaudin. We want them to review it more frequently. Well, on that, we certainly agree. We proposed an amendment. Unfortunately, the Liberals voted against it. And it'll be reviewed in 10 years, unfortunately, even if French is in decline all over Canada. Now, beyond consultations, Today, help me to help an official language minority community in Quebec. It's Anglophones. Elsewhere, it's Francophones. What would you like to see in the regulation, specifically, in order to improve things and have fast results? We spoke about consultation, certainly. They consult, they don't take much away from it, dialogue. So consultation, let's be clear about consultations. It's all well and good to say consultations. One must have resources to properly respond to the different institutions to tell them what we need. We do not have those resources. We cannot be consulted by 7, 8, 15 institutions, even us. We are funded to do that, but it's tough. It's tough to respond to all the requests for consultations. The other organizations are not equipped to do so. So maybe we could change the consultation process. Exactly. First point, improve the consultation process. 2, how do we get results? Give me examples. Today, there's a draft regulation. We want to improve it. We have the same goal, protect OLMCs. But there's a specific situation in French. The official language is French. How can we put something in the regulation that will allow us to have better results and to tell the TBS, put that in the regulation, you'll help us to meet our goals, the goals that you should have already written because they've had 3 years. I think your issue, our issue, you don't have an issue. Well, I have one, but it's personal. Our issue comes...
I think that's where the problem is. You haven't got enough meat in the act to allow you to go much further. And that's why we need revision in 5 years. That's your problem.
Madame Martin-Laforge.
I'll stop you there. We won't change the act. We have a hard time fixing the regulation. And the act was voted on, one Liberal voted against it, everyone else voted for it. And it'll be reviewed in 10 years. But if we don't want to fight, let's focus our energies on the regulation. 40 seconds. If you have indicators that it's going well in the act, you can start to make suggestions. Secondly, indicators in the regulations to allow for changes. I'm trying to speed things up because we don't have a lot of time. And trust the vitality framework that already exists. We don't have to create another framework. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Godin. Last speaker, Mr. Villeneuve, 5 minutes. Thank you very much. Hello. I'm happy to see you today. You used to live in Bromont, I believe. I know, and moreover, people from the Eastern Township, I've met them multiple times. We spoke to different issues this summer, and we really tried to help them. I'd like to get back to what Mr. Godin mentioned earlier. Yes, there's the Act. The Act won't be changed tomorrow morning, but I'm curious. You said the Act doesn't have enough substance. What would real substance be for you? An act with more substance. As we said earlier, I won't be able to change the act today. The act is what it is. Now, for regulations. If we find the regulations do not properly fulfill what they ought to, neither for us or for the FCFA, we must be able to find means.
Spot somewhere in those regulations where we could all agree. What's the sweet spot? I think Marion might be able to answer more precisely. But I'd like you to all think, we all want a sweet spot here in the regulation. Go ahead.
In our brief, we talk about the history of Part 7 and...
Can you open your microphone? I need the translation.
Sorry about that. In our brief, we talk about the history of Part 7 and it being really general, and then it became justiciable at one point, and then the modernization movement happened in 2017 all the way through 2022, and all the minority communities were asking for the same thing, more specificity in Part 7, more teeth, plus de mordant dans la partie 7. And all kinds of proposals came out about how to better define positive measures, better specify them, put it in the Act. Yes, definitions, outcomes in the Act. What the Modernized Act actually says is federal institutions must take positive measures. It doesn't define them, and it doesn't require any specific positive measures. So although the Act has more, Part 7 is more detailed, it has more words, most of that detail is still procedural. C'est une obligation de moyens et non pas une obligation de résultat.
It's an obligation of means and not an obligation of results. So that's the framework within which the regulations are proposed. So there are limits as to what the regulations can obtain, considering its framework in the Act. Thank you very much.
The actual access of English-speaking Quebecers to federal services in English, particularly in regions where that access is limited.
How do we measure it ourselves?
Yep.
Well, we consult a lot. We're on est sur le terrain.
We're on the field.
Let me give you a good news story. A few years ago, many years ago, when the first action plan came out, there has been a progression of the understanding of the needs and priorities of the English-speaking community over the years. In the last action plan, a big chunk of money, $100 million, came to support economic prosperity, vulnerability, and employment. That was the first time that we saw something that we needed in the Act. Townshippers got a nice chunk of money out of that. So the institutions are trying, but they listen. It's always by listening, paying attention, coming to our events, looking at the Vitality Framework. Those are the ways that we know that the efforts of the federal government are making a difference. We know that because we've been asking, and it's not only checking the boxes. There has been serious understanding of what our needs are and funding those needs.
20 secondes. C'est tout? Fini? Okay.
Are you done? Thank you.
The members, we'd like to thank you for being here today. That completes our time. So we thank you, Ms. Martin-Laforge, Ms. Sandilands, thank you for being here. On behalf of the committee, I apologize that we started a little bit late because of the commemoration of the 4-year anniversary of the war in Ukraine. But we thank you for being here today and for your contributions. Les collègues, je vais suspendre pour quelques minutes.
Dear colleagues, we'll suspend for a few minutes as we prepare for the next. Into meeting number 22 of the Official Languages Committee. Now we shall continue with our second panel. I would like to welcome our witnesses. Appearing as an individual, Linda Cardinal, Emeritus Professor, University of Ottawa. Appearing by video conference, welcome for the Réseau pour le développement de l'alphabétisme et des compétences. We have Geoffrey Krajewski, Chair, appearing by video conference. Welcome, and Denis Degagné, Executive Director, appearing here in person. You are welcome. Each organization will have 5 minutes for their opening remarks, after which we will proceed to questions from members of Parliament. Let me start with Ms. Cardinal. You have 5 minutes, madam. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I am now co-chair of the External Advisory Group on the Development and Dissemination of French Language Information, but I'm speaking to you today in my personal capacity as a specialist in language policy and emeritus professor at the University of Ottawa School of Political Studies. I would like to start by making an initial recommendation, which I will explain later. The proposed regulations need to be revisited and revised to improve its relevance and scope. Let's remember that Part 7 has a political nature. In 1988, it was intended to complement the Meat-Lake Accords provision on Quebec's distinct character by making the Canadian government the trustee of official language minorities. But 7 and 5, which recognize the right of public servants to work in the official languages of their choice, marked a major shift in the area of official languages. They create new obligations for the Canadian government. However, the political dimension made implementation difficult. It's only in 2003, with the publication of the first action plan for official languages, that implementation of Part 7 could finally begin.
The late Senator Gauthier understood well at the time that Part 7 was toothless, to use his expression. In 2005, he succeeded in adding a new provision to the Official Languages Act requiring the government to take positive measures to make Part 7 enforceable, and also justiciable by making it possible to bring cases before the federal court. In 2005, Senator Gauthier also wanted regulations for Part 7, but it took 20 years for that to happen. The new OLA confirms the essential role of Part 7 in government action toward official language minorities. It invokes the concept of affirmative action as an indispensable dimension of its implementation. However, the proposed regulations, which are the vehicle for this implementation, do not live up to the expectations that have been placed upon them. Like Part 7, the direct regulations are political in nature. They express good intentions, but nothing concrete. They do not include specific guidelines. They provide for the production of analyses, the results of which will be recorded without specifying how they will be published and disseminated. It provides for dialogue and consultation, but nothing very binding. We do not know how the recorded analyses will be used to improve the proposed initiatives or confirm their role in advancing substantive equality. In short, the proposed draft regulation fails to provide us with a methodology that would inject more life into the implementation of Part 7. It is a draft regulation that ultimately weakens Part 7 by failing to provide clear guidelines for its implementation. It does not provide the means to produce lasting results in pursuit of substantive equality, including in the case of federal, provincial, and territorial agreements or arrangements. My main recommendation is that the draft regulations be reworked and revised to make it more relevant and ambitious. There must be guidelines for taking positive measures to overcome barriers to substantive equality. These measures, as stated in the OLA, must be concrete and taken with the intention of having a favorable effect on the implementation of the Canadian government's commitments in Section 6 of Part 7. The draft regulations cannot ignore this approach and must explain how it has understood these two dimensions: concrete measures and the intention to have a favorable effect. Second recommendation: the draft regulations must define what a concrete measure is and include guidelines to help public servants identify and develop them. A concrete measure, as can be extrapolated from the OLA, must be based on the needs of official language minorities, which will be identified through dialogue and consultation. Part 7 refers to concrete measures because these must necessarily be rooted in a context and a place, respond to needs, and produce structural results. However, this is not at all mentioned in the draft regulations, yet these are defining elements that could help guide action. Providing guidelines for identifying concrete measures and analyzing them to identify best practices could not only help with the implementation of Part 7, but also serve to develop them. The third recommendation concerns the need for guidelines to measure the intention to have a favorable effect on the implementation of the Canadian government's commitments as set out in Part 7. My recommendation is that the draft regulations should propose a methodology based on language-specific analysis, now commonly referred to as LENS. Such an approach already exists within the Canadian government, ESDC, IRCC. The TBS could draw on this approach to complete its guidelines for the development of concrete measures. My apologies, your time is up. Can I simply ask you for 1 or 2 sentences to wrap it up? Yes. In conclusion, I'll just say that the draft regulations do not propose a methodology or indicators. It was 3 years that were wasted. And I hope that the review of the draft regulations won't take another 3 years. Thank you. Before we go to our next witness, Mr. Koryevsky, I know we worked on your sound. Could you speak for 10 seconds? Yes, hello. I spoke with a technician. They told us it hadn't been approved by the interpreters. Yes, it works. Okay, 5 minutes. To the network. Thank you. Dear committee members, first we would like to thank you for including us in your work. Having been closely involved in the work surrounding Bill C-13, we are fully aware of the important role your committee played in that matter and continues to play in this draft regulation. My name is Jeffrey Krajewski, and I am the president of the Literacy and Skills Development Network. I am accompanied today by our executive director, Denis Guénanier. We have prepared a short brief, which we are submitting and invite you to consult. It contains specific recommendations concerning the draft bill. In the time allotted to us for our opening remarks, we would like to highlight a few points. First, a word about the concept that is at the heart of our mandate: lifelong learning in a Francophone minority context. This concept is now enshrined in the OLA 41.3. This is one of the most innovative amendments resulting from C-13. For the first time, a quasi-constitutional text recognizes that the social, economic, cultural, and identity success of Francophones in Canada requires learning opportunities beyond the institutional framework of elementary, secondary, and post-secondary education. To succeed in 2026, Francophones must have opportunities in their own language and throughout their lives to expand their skills so they can operate in a rapidly changing world. Every day across the country, hundreds of organizations and businesses offer such learning opportunities in non-formal and informal settings. Unfortunately, there is a great need for leadership and positive measures to ensure that Francophone organizations and businesses in minority situations can count on the same resources as Canada's English-speaking majority. To succeed, these organizations and businesses need the support of the federal government, as provided for in the Act. The draft regulations were tabled nearly 3 years after C-13 came into force. In examining the merits of this draft, we believe it is important to highlight the lack of significant progress in implementing the new provisions of the Act. There is no justification for the current lack of action. The role of the TBS should be transformed, and we should already have a new relationship in collaboration with the federal departments that reflects the provisions of Part 7 of the Act. However, We are still a long way from such a scenario. In its brief, the FCFA submitted recommendations that we support. Our objective here is to clarify or highlight 4 points that affect lifelong learning. First, regarding factors to be considered in the analysis that federal institutions should conduct, the list currently included in 466 of the draft regulation must include a direct reference to learning in non-formal and informal contexts. Otherwise, it would be a step backward from what is provided for in the OLA. Our brief includes wording to that effect. Second, regarding all the work involved in conducting analyses and to support the development of positive measures or the adoption of language clauses and agreements signed with provinces and territories, it is imperative that these analyses be shared with the communities that are specifically targeted by them. The wording of 4.5 of the draft regulation is inadequate, as it simply requires that these analyses be recorded. We therefore recommend that 4.5 of the draft be amended to require federal institutions to systematically publish the entirety of the analyses they conduct in Part 7 of the OLA. Third, regarding language clauses and agreements signed between the federal government and the provinces and territories, it is key to ensure a high level of transparency in this matter. In its current form, 7.4 of the draft provides federal institutions notify the TBS of the publication of any agreement made under 41.10.1 of the Act. Such notification is of no use to our communities unless they are also informed of these publications. We recommend that subsection 7.4 of the draft be amended to create an obligation for the TBS to include in its annual report a list of all language clauses adopted during the fiscal year covered by each report. Finally, the draft bill must clarify the procedures for dealing with situations where a federal institution fails to meet its obligations under Part 7 of the OLA. The nature of these obligations and the interactions that are anticipated between federal institutions and our communities mean that it would be ineffective and inefficient to expect Francophone communities to systematically turn to the Commissioner or the federal court every time a problem arises. While these two avenues remain essential, they are nonetheless insufficient. We recommend that provisions be added to provide for alternative means of resolving disputes between a federal institution and communities. In conclusion, I would like to reiterate that the inclusion of subsection 41.3 of the OLA represents a historic gain for our communities. The regulations adopted in support of this provision must now enable it to have the anticipated impact. Considerable work remains to be done to achieve this. Thank you. We are ready to take your questions. Thank you. Now, Mr. Gaudin, 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Krajewski and your colleague here with us today. First, Madame Cardinal, I didn't invite you, but what you said is music to my ears. I've been going on for years saying that the bill hasn't met its goals. Moreover, after 3 years of work, the TBS came out with this draft regulation that, in my opinion, is inadequate. Now, let's be constructive. Where do we start? What are the priorities that we need to establish? You know perfectly well that we can't have a perfect regulation during the revision of this draft regulation. Where do we start? What are the priorities? Please sum us up an action plan so that we can get results. Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Gaudin. I'm very happy to speak to you because every time that I've appeared before the committee, you were elsewhere, and so it's really a pleasure to meet you. Where do we begin? I'd say that we'd begin by removing the the conditional terms. So I would invite you to go count the number of times possible appears in the regulation. It's a regulation that makes declarations, that doesn't propose any executions. That's the first thing to do. Everywhere where it's possible, there need to be guidelines. There need to be things to do, not possibles and cans. That doesn't work. A regulation isn't mandatory. It's an option. And if we've said that the regulation is necessary to implement Part 7, well, there was a problem before this implementation, that the implementation of Part 7 was problematic, although I think Heritage Canada's team is doing good work around Part 7. But we said, we need a regulation. We said, okay, we've waited for 3 years, there are consultations, and we've got a regulation that's very similar to the Act, that doesn't make any improvements, and it's inadequate. And it also neglects elements on promoting French in diplomatic relations. Moreover, the regulation needs to help meet a specific goal, which is substantive equality. So the progress of the use and the status of French and English, well, where are the guidelines? Where are the guidelines so we can see the harmonization between the guidelines and the regulation? I'd say to start there. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I wasn't there in the past, but I'm here today, and I'm going to take advantage of that. Tell me. In your opening remarks, you talked about defining concrete measures. How can we define concrete measures? What elements ought to be there in order to make it easier to interpret so that we can get execution? What you're saying is quite interesting, because since 2005 there have been positive measures in the law, in the Act, so the government has some experience in positive measures. Did the TBS do any research to know what best practices were? They could have relied on that to decide on what positive measures are. There's a document from 2001 that I highly recommend you read that was prepared by Mr. Jean-Claude Leblanc, who was the Official Languages Commissioner at the time. And he created that document from his research related to Part 7 and positive measures. At the time, positive measures was not yet in the law, but positive measures were discussed, and there were other terms used as well. There were 30 recommendations in that document regarding Part 7, and he studied different sectors, HR, culture, to see what the best practices were. So it's not because the TBS doesn't have access to considerable research on the subject from the past. We can clearly see that what has been done was based on consultations, but there's experience from the federal government. Now there's the Francophone immigration policy. But is that... thank you. I think you gave us some solutions. In conclusion, because I don't have much time, do we need to wipe the blackboard clean and start fresh? Time is up, so please a quick response. I'm not saying we have to completely wipe the slate clean, but we need to rework it like a student that's submitted an inadequate piece of homework. Mr. Deschênes-Thériault, 6 minutes. Thank you. Thank you for your remarks. You mentioned that the government needs to propose methodology regarding substantive equality. What would that be like on the ground? Can you give me some examples, please? Substantive equality, what does that mean? Over the last 20 years, There's been jurisprudence, legal precedent on the OLA. The substantive equality means we have to work to overcome obstacles to equality, contextual obstacles, in order to improve the status of minority languages in Canada. The methodology must repose upon that basis. The other key element of this methodology is concrete measures, as I just explained to your colleague. If we're speaking of substantive equality, how does a community define substantive equality in dialogue and consultation? That would be quite relevant to think about. And a regulation that says they'll do consultations, well, maybe they'll shelve them because maybe there's a requirement to publish conclusions, because when we work with communities, we have to explain why we didn't retain their suggestions. That's even in European agreements. And so it's not something that's unreasonable. And so when we're talking about concrete measures and methodology, we can ask ourselves, is by and for an example of positive measures that can lead to substantive equality? The Francophone immigration policy, is that an example that can bring about substantive equality? I don't know if that answers your question.
Talking about accountability, many witnesses told us that these proposed regulations do not give us the right guidelines to ensure proper implementation. I would like to know what you think about it, and what do we mean when we talk about concrete mechanisms for accountability? You know, the Treasury Board ensures accountability with its annual report. Now, they ask people to self-assess. If I ask my students how to evaluate themselves, they will give themselves a score of 9 on 10. Self-evaluation reports, do they suffice? Maybe we need to revise the questions and add questions related to substantive equality and other elements that relate to Part 7. I would like to see a special annex in the Treasury Board report. So there has to be one on Part 7. That's one example of accountability, an accountability measure that will be very relevant, because it talks about, we are talking about something that exists. We are not reinventing the wheel. We are simply innovating a practice that exists already. So it's a small step that could help clarify accountability. Thank you. You also said the Act provides for a commitment to promote the use of the language in diplomacy. It's not mentioned in the proposed regulations. So do you think it's important to be more explicit when we talk about monitoring implementation of these commitments? That's one example of substantive equality. We recognize the vulnerability of French, and we recognize that it has been documented not only by journalists, but there was a Foreign Affairs Committee some time back that demonstrated that there was a need for that in diplomacy. So diplomatic action is essential in the two official languages. So we simply cannot engage in international relations in English. We also need diplomatic relations in French so that we can be more present in the international francophonie. There is scientific diplomacy as well. So maybe it was simply forgotten in the regulations. I don't know if it was just something that was forgotten. Many things have been mentioned, but we cannot avoid that dimension. I have 1 minute left. One last question. Now, your third recommendation, you talked about the lens that will guide implementation of commitments under Part 7. Could you tell us what you mean by the lens? Could you explain why this tool will be important in this context? The lens already exists in IRCC. It exists already in the federal government. How come the Treasury Board is not interested in this tool, because we need to develop a more innovative methodology that relies on Part 7 and substantive equality. And the lens is the best tool, because the lens provides good questions that should be asked when it comes to any initiative, program, or project. It forces us to look at the impact of the programs on the targeted population, in this case minorities, and proposes corrective measures, or asks the stakeholders to propose corrective measures to make sure that there's substantive equality and that the objectives are met. Thank you very much. A lot of time has gone by, so I'll give the floor to Mr. Boileau now for 6 minutes. Thank you, Madam Cardinal. We have seen each other many times in the past, but there's something that is very new in the New Official Languages Act that concerns Quebec and Francophones outside Quebec. Some articles have adopted an asymmetric approach. French is recognized. We recognize that French is declining throughout Canada. We recognize that Francophone and Anglophone minorities have different needs. There are also some articles that claim that there will be measures taken to promote French in Quebec. They're also looking into the situation of French outside Quebec and looking at the positive measures. There's a need to promote French in every province and territory. All these new concepts are there, but they have not been implemented so far. In Quebec, there's no new positive measure for French. There were no consultations for Francophones except for the government, what was done by the Treasury Board. Of course, the regulations are not really helping. Even TALC, that was here before, noted that as well. So I'd like to know what you think about all these factors. Thank you very much, Mr. Boileau. You are right. The Official Languages Act, particularly Part 7 in its preamble and its interpretation principles, are all new. I had the opportunity to discuss that at many conferences. Canada has really come up with new things, especially with the idea of substantive equality. But once the concept has been integrated, you need the tools, you need substantive equality approaches, and that's what has to be done. The regulations prioritized a political approach. This is a political approach that refers to the old law that was simply a declaration. It's as if the regulation was simply a declaration and there was no binding obligation to implement it. But Part 7 should help. Part 7 should help in its implementation. So maybe that's something that public servants need to learn to do. They need to learn to use Part 7. Now they need to look into the leadership of the Treasury Board. When there were reforms and consultations on modernization, I always believed in the leadership of Canadian heritage, and these regulations have now led me to believe that I was right, because we have a political approach towards Part 7 instead of a concrete approach. Even look at Statistics Canada. We could find data that will help us compare the situation of the Francophonie in Canada, not simply comparing the Francophones outside Quebec and Anglophones in Quebec. We need to look at all these approaches. The regulations could help us look into all that. Now, talking about consultations, here again, I have to interrupt you because we don't have much time. From your understanding of the Act, should there be measures for French, in favor of French in Quebec? According to my interpretation of the Act, there are already measures promoting French in Quebec, measures for the promotion of French in diplomatic relations in Canada. This does not only concern Acadians. What new measures? This wasn't there before. Look at the Act. This is new. This measure is very new, but it's very indirect for Quebec. It's not indirect. Now, on the ground in Quebec, there's a decline in French that we see. Look at public accounts, programs that support official languages. Every year I look at that. I look into public accounts. We try to find grants below 100,000, but there's nothing new for French in Quebec. I'm sorry, you have 30 seconds left. Measures for learning French, for measures to fund the French language learning exist, but there's no additional resources. Well, you need to turn to the right people for that. Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. Dear colleagues, we have about 10 minutes left for our meeting. I will have to shorten the last round of questioning, so I'll give the floor to Mr. Dalton. You have 2 minutes, sir. Thank you. Madam Cardinal, you are using very strong terms, talking about regulations. And you have said 3 years have been lost, that it's lazy what has happened. We hear your frustration. I have a small question. Why? What is happening? Why do we get here after all these years? You have recounted the history somewhat, but how come we find ourselves in this situation today with the proposed regulations? So why? That's a good question. Very quickly, behind the why, there's the issue of political will. That is fundamental. Where should leadership come from at the Treasury Board to make sure that the regulations make sense? It comes from the Treasury Board Secretariat, from the highest level. I think that over the last 3 years, there was a lot of movement, lots of changes, and every time drafting of the regulations was postponed, and then there was also pressure from civil society. Thank you very much. I have 20 seconds left. I will ask Mr. Desgagnés a question. You told the committee that on the 9th of October that nothing has changed and that there is no action and that we are backpedaling. Could you say a word about that? A few sentences, because we don't have much time. Over the past 3 years, our sector looks at skills. You can go see the brief that we tabled at the Finance Committee. We present a picture of what has not changed, and it looks a lot like what Ms. Cardinal told us. So it's all in the Act, the informal and the formal, but we don't find that in the regulations. So we're going backwards. All that should be in the regulations. Thank you. The time is up. I'll now give the floor to Mr. Villeneuve for 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much. Ms. Cardinal, we only have 2 minutes. I have a short question for you. As part of our study on these proposed regulations, what lessons can we draw from other regulations as we try to implement the Official Languages Act? What do you have to say to that? What you're saying is interesting. There's another regulation concerning the Official Languages Act, and that is the one for Part 4, Communication with the Public and Service Provision. I don't know if you've seen those regulations. It's exactly the same thing. It's clear what a request is. Everything is clear. It's said we know what we're doing. Compare that with the regulations for Part 7, and you will see that this is totally different. As I said, it's optional, a regulation. So if we decided to proceed by regulation for Part 7, it's because we thought it was important to have regulations. The regulations do not reflect the importance we want to give it, in my opinion. If we think that the regulations for Part 4 are a model, well, maybe we don't want to take it as a model, but what we have in Part 4 is stringent, and it's something we don't see in Part 7. This is unfortunate. I'm sorry for those who wrote that. The wording in Part 7 is not clear. It's not a language we see in regulations. Thank you very much. How much time do we have left? 25 seconds? Why are you saying that it can't be implemented? I'm not an expert, but I'm just curious. We don't know who is recording what. If it's being recorded, what is the purpose? And then guidelines are provided on possible positive measures that could be taken if ever it is decided that they are necessary. Listen, it's not clear. It's not precise enough, especially when we know the history of all the positive measures from 2005. We know that there were positive measures. So the situation needs to be clarified. There should have been a previous study. Thank you very much. Your time is up. Mr. Villeneuve, I give the floor to Mr. Beaulieu. Thank you very much. It's paradoxal because the FCFA and other groups thought that Part 7 or several parts of the Official Languages Act had not been sufficiently implemented. So we thought we'll hand that over to the Treasury Board that controls the purse, and they will be able to force the institutions to take action. What we are saying is that the Treasury Board is not interested. We met the minister. He did not even know that he was the one who was responsible for management of Part 7. So there's a lack of will, irrespective of the means we use. It's as if the federal government's approach is simply cosmetic when it comes to the Official Languages Act. We see the same errors being repeated 50 years over. It's a good idea. You mentioned the integration of informal education. One or two sentences, Ms. Cardinal. Thank you all for your questions. I hope you continue doing a good job. I hope that the regulations will be reviewed for them to be more relevant and effective. Thank you very much. 2 MPs have questions. It's not over. Mr. Godin, you have 2 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Krajewski, we didn't hear you speak a lot, unfortunately. So in your introduction, you talked about transparency when it comes to language clauses. Mr. Krajewski or Mr. Deganye, in the regulation, it is stated that we need to promote the inclusion of 7.1a and B propose provisions that should be included. What I'll propose to the Treasury Board is that they add 7C to make public the provisions that the federal government will include in the proposal. We know that during negotiations, there are not exchanges. We don't have exchanges, but we see what is presented as a federal government, and it becomes an obligation, and subsequently, after negotiations, we see what can be done. Do you think it's a good idea? Yes. Yes, indeed. That's one of the points that we considered. I'm sorry. I just want you to confirm that you find that positive. Something else. Federal institutions, and a while ago, you talked about other means of resolving conflicts without necessarily going to court. Could you please tell me more about that? 25 seconds left. To be brief, the idea is to avoid turning to the Commission or to the federal courts to resolve conflicts. So the idea is to provide alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. What I understand, Mr. Krajewski.
You would like there to be something in the regulation that would allow for that way of defense rather than depending on the administrative process and save time and money. Quick response, yes. Sorry to cut you off, but I think it's important for you to tell us that. I wanted to hear you say that. Thank you. Last speaker, Madame Mingarelli. Thank you very much. I'll ask you questions, Professor Cardinal. You previously spoke regarding the various bills between C-13 and a different bill. Can you speak to that? In the bill? You're not talking about the regulations? Yes, in the bill, regarding the bill if possible, or I have other questions. What distinguishes the bill is that the TBS was to become a central agency for the entire act. That really surprised me at the time. I wasn't one of those saying that TBS should have that role. Then there were some adjustments in the preamble, so that was a major change. Thank you. 45 seconds. All right. Some of the experts' recommendations weren't adopted. Which one should have been conserved? Well, those experts, well, we were asked to define a high Francophone presence in the context of the implementation of the federally regulated private businesses act, and so we're waiting for regulations that will be related to that. So I didn't make any recommendations at the time for the act in its entirety. We really worked on that specific aspect of the new act. Thank you. Thank you very much. On behalf of the committee, I would like to thank the witnesses for being with us today, in person and online. Apologies for the technical issues. Thank you for your testimony. Our next meeting will be held on Thursday. We will hear from witnesses on Part 7 regulations during the first hour, and the second hour will be devoted to reviewing the draft report on administrative and monetary penalties. A copy of the report has been distributed. Thank you very much, and we will adjourn.